There was a soldier who could not remember why he went to war, and this forgetting would become the most important thing that ever happened to him. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day. And if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. His name was Marcus Webb, and he had been a soldier for so long that he could barely remember being anything else. When he tried to think back to his childhood, to the time before military service, the memories seemed to belong to someone else, a different person who had a different life in a different world. That person felt distant, unreal, almost fictional. Marcus was 43 years old, though he felt much older. 22 of those years had been spent in the military. He had served in 3 different wars, in 4 different countries, under 5 different commanding officers. He had been promoted and demoted, commended and court-martialed, wounded and healed. He had seen things that human eyes were not designed to see, things that the human mind did not want to hold. And through it all, he had continued, because continuing was what soldiers did. He could not clearly remember the first war he had served in. It seemed to have happened in another lifetime, when he was young and stupid, and full of idealistic notions about duty and honor and protecting his country. Something about an aggressor nation, something about defending democracy. The details were fuzzy. The reasons which had seemed so clear at the time had become obscured by the passage of years and the accumulation of other wars, other missions, other reasons that were equally or more compelling. The second war was clearer in his memory, though not in the way he would have wished. He remembered the faces of men who died. He remembered the sound of explosions. He remembered the weight of a rifle in his hands and the particular feeling of firing at human targets and watching them fall. He remembered the smell of burned flesh and the taste of dust and blood. He remembered the interrogation that had gone badly, the rules of engagement that had become unclear, the confusion about who the enemy was, and whether certain people qualified as legitimate targets. The third war, the most recent, the one from which he had only returned 6 months ago, was perhaps the least clear in his memory, which was strange because it was so recent. He had been involved in what was officially called a stabilization operation in a country whose name he could barely pronounce and whose political situation he did not understand. Something about terrorists, something about preventing regional instability, something about humanitarian concerns. But the clear reasons, the ones that made sense in basic terms, seemed to have evaporated. The mission had been vague. The objectives had been undefined. The enemy had been whoever his commanding officers told him was the enemy on any given day. When Marcus had returned from this last deployment, he had been given 2 months of leave before being assigned to his next posting. 2 months to rest, to recover, to transition back to civilian life, and then back again to military life. 2 months that had turned into the most confusing and disorienting period of his life, for reasons he could not quite articulate. Marcus lived in a small apartment in a town near the military base where he was stationed. The apartment was sparse, almost empty. He owned very little. The military had trained him not to need things, not to accumulate possessions, not to get attached to places or material objects. In this, the military had been effective. Marcus had almost nothing that he cared about. His few possessions were practical clothes, a computer, a television, books. Even these things he did not care about deeply. They were simply there, utilitarian and functional. The apartment had no decorations on the walls. There were no photographs, no mementos of his travels or his family, no representations of anything he valued or loved. The walls were blank white. The furniture was minimal and impersonal. Looking at his living space, someone might have concluded that no one actually lived there, that it was a space in transit, occupied by someone who was not fully present, who was always elsewhere in spirit. In the first few days after returning from his last deployment, Marcus had tried to sleep normally, to adjust to civilian time, to live like a person who was not a soldier. But sleep was difficult. His body was trained to operate on military sleep schedules, brief periods of rest interrupted by sudden wakefulness, never fully entering deep sleep, because deep sleep made a soldier vulnerable. When he tried to sleep 8 hours in a bed like a civilian, his mind became restless. He would fall asleep and then wake at 03:00 hours, his body convinced that this was a time of danger, his adrenaline spiking with a sense of threat that he could not explain. After a few nights of this, he had given up trying to sleep like a normal person. Instead, he slept when he needed to, for as long as his body would allow, often sleeping during the day and lying awake at night. This reversal of the normal sleep cycle seemed to suit him better, though it made it difficult to interact with anyone else, since most of the world operated on a daytime waking schedule. The apartment was located in a quiet neighborhood of similar apartments, home to a mix of military families, young professionals, and retired people. There was not much life in the neighborhood during the day. People left in the morning for work or school and returned in the evening. During his deployment, Marcus had often thought about coming home to this neighborhood, imagining it as a place of peace and normalcy. But now that he was actually here, the neighborhood felt strange and artificial. The quiet seemed wrong. The routine seemed oppressive. The normalcy seemed almost hostile. He had tried, in the first weeks of his leave, to do normal things. He had gone to restaurants and found the experience disorienting too many people. Too much noise, the smell of unfamiliar foods and strangers' perfume and deodorant, creating a sensory overload that made him anxious. He had gone to movies and found that he could not concentrate, that loud noises made him jump, that scenes of violence triggered responses in his body that he could not control. He had tried to go out in public, to walk around the town, and found that he was always scanning for threats, always aware of who was around him, always calculating angles and distances and potential points of danger. After a few such outings, Marcus had stopped trying. It was easier to stay in the apartment. It was quieter there. He could control the sensory environment. He could manage the threat level. He could exist in a state that, while not comfortable, was at least stable and predictable. It was during one of these idle periods, one of these long afternoons when he had nothing to do and nowhere to go, that Marcus found the letter. He was going through boxes of things that had been stored in his mother's attic and shipped to him after she died 3 years ago. There were not many boxes. Marcus had never accumulated much, even before the military. Most of what was in the boxes consisted of things from his childhood and adolescence, things that his mother had kept for sentimental reasons, but that he had never cared about. Schoolwork, photographs, little trophies from youth athletics competitions, things of no real value. But in one of the boxes, near the bottom, he found an old composition notebook. The cover was worn and discolored. Inside, in handwriting that he recognized as his own, but which seemed to have been written by someone else, someone very young and very different from who he was now, were pages of writing. Journal entries, plans, dreams, lists of things he wanted to do with his life. The handwriting dated the earliest entry to when he was 17 years old. That would have been just before he joined the military. Marcus did not remember writing in this journal. He did not remember having these dreams. As he read the yellowed pages, he felt like he was reading someone else's diary, the intimate thoughts of a stranger. The young Marcus, the 17-year-old Marcus, had written about his passion for architecture. He had been a good student in mathematics and geometry, and he had become fascinated by the way buildings were designed, the way spaces were organized, the way structures could be beautiful and functional at the same time. In his journal, young Marcus had sketched drawings of buildings that he wanted to design. He had written about wanting to study architecture in college. He had written about wanting to design public buildings, libraries, schools, community centers, things that would serve people and improve their lives. Young Marcus had written about wanting to travel, to see great buildings, and to understand how different cultures expressed themselves through architecture. He had written about Italy, about Greece, about Japan, about studying how different peoples had created beauty and meaning through the structures they built. He had written about wanting to live in different places, to experience different cultures, to have a life that was not confined to one location or one way of living. Young Marcus had written about wanting to have a family someday. He had written about what kind of father he wanted to be, present, engaged, involved in his children's lives, different from his own father, who had been distant and cold. He had written about wanting to create a home that was warm and full of life, a place where his children and grandchildren would want to gather. Young Marcus had written about wanting to fall in love. He had written in an almost embarrassed tone about wanting to experience romantic love, to find a partner who understood him, to build a life with someone who made him happy. And then, after several entries that chronicled these dreams and aspirations, there was an entry dated several months later in which young Marcus wrote about his decision to join the military. The entry was briefer than the earlier ones. He wrote, "My father thinks I should get a college degree and become an architect. He says the military is a waste of time and talent. But I've been thinking about it for a long time, and I think I need to do this. I need to serve my country. I need to be part of something larger than myself. I know my father won't understand, but I feel like it's the right thing to do. I feel called to serve. Maybe after my service, I'll be able to go back to school and become an architect. But right now, I need to do this." After that entry, the journal stopped. There were no more entries. Young Marcus had either put the journal away and never taken it up again, or he had lost it, or most likely he had simply forgotten about it, moving forward into the life of a soldier and letting go of the dreams of the boy who had written in this notebook. Marcus sat in his apartment, holding the journal in his hands, and felt something shift in his chest. It was a painful feeling, uncomfortable and disorienting. It was as if he was encountering a part of himself that he had successfully buried and forgotten, a part of himself that he had moved past and left behind. But now, suddenly, confronted with the evidence of who he had been, of what he had wanted, of the dreams he had abandoned, that buried part of himself was stirring, coming back to life, demanding to be acknowledged. He read through the journal again, more carefully this time, paying attention to the details, trying to understand the mind of the 17-year-old boy who had written these words. That boy had wanted so many things. He had had such clear ideas about the future he wanted to create. He had believed that his life would be full of meaning and accomplishment and beauty. He had believed that he would design buildings that would help people. He had believed that he would travel and experience beauty. He had believed that he would have a family and a loving home. He had believed that his life would matter. And now, at 43 years old, Marcus looked back at that boy with something like pity and something like contempt. The boy had been naive. He had not understood that most dreams do not come true. He had not understood the difficulty of pursuing the things you wanted. He had not understood that life was more complicated than writing down your wishes in a journal and expecting them to come true. But even as he felt contempt for the boy's naivety, Marcus also felt something else, a deep sadness, a grief for the person he had been, for the life he might have had if things had been different. When had he stopped wanting these things? When had the dreams faded? It had not been a single moment of decision. It had been a gradual erosion, a slow process of letting go, of accepting that some things were not meant to be, of adjusting expectations to fit the life he was living rather than the life he wanted to live. He wondered if there was a moment when he could have chosen differently. If, at 18, when he had first joined the military, someone had given him the choice to go back, to pursue his original dreams, to become an architect instead of a soldier, would he have taken it? He thought honestly that he probably would have. The military had seemed like a good idea at the time, a way to serve, a way to achieve something, a way to become more than what he was. But he was not sure the young Marcus would have made the same choice if he had known that 22 years would pass, that he would never make it back to those dreams, that the boy's aspirations would simply fade away into memory. Marcus began to spend time researching architecture. He went to the public library and checked out books on famous architects and famous buildings. He looked at photographs of buildings from around the world and tried to understand what made them beautiful, or functional, or meaningful. He found himself drawn to certain buildings: the Guggenheim Museum in New York, the Sydney Opera House, the temples of Kyoto, the great cathedrals of Europe. He looked at these buildings and felt something that he could not quite name, something that seemed to come from a part of himself that had been dormant for so long that he had forgotten it existed. He began to sketch. Using the skills he had never forgotten from his geometry classes and from the dream of his youth, he started to draw buildings. Not actual buildings that existed in the world, but imagined buildings, creations of his own mind. He drew libraries with soaring ceilings and natural light. He drew community centers with spaces for gathering and learning. He drew homes that were warm and inviting, places where people would want to live. As he drew, he felt a strange sense of peace, a sense of purpose, a sense that he was doing something that mattered. This activity, this drawing and research, and thinking about architecture, became the center of his life in the remaining weeks of his leave. He would spend entire days absorbed in it, barely noticing the passage of time. He would lose himself in design problems, in working out how to make a space both beautiful and functional, in imagining how people would move through and use the spaces he was designing. The other soldiers he knew, the men he had served with, would have mocked this activity if they had known about it. Architecture was not considered a masculine pursuit in military culture. Real soldiers did not spend their time drawing buildings and reading about design. Real soldiers maintained their physical fitness, kept their weapons clean, studied military tactics, and prepared for the next deployment. The idea of spending hours drawing pictures of buildings would have been seen as soft, as a waste of time, as not being serious about soldiering. But Marcus found that he no longer cared what other soldiers thought. For 22 years, he had shaped his life around the opinions and expectations of military culture. He had adopted military values, military mannerisms, military ways of thinking and being. He had become, in many ways, a pure soldier, someone for whom the military was not just a job but an identity, not just an organization, but a way of life. And yet, increasingly, he was beginning to feel that this identity, which had seemed so complete and so permanent, was in fact quite fragile. Beneath the surface of the soldier, there was another person, the person who had dreamed of becoming an architect, the person who wanted to create beauty, the person who wanted to have a meaningful life that was not defined by warfare and destruction. After 3 weeks of this absorbing work, of research and sketching and dreaming, Marcus did something he had not done in years. He called his father. His father, Robert Webb, was 71 years old and lived in the same house where Marcus had grown up, a small house in a town 200 miles away. They had not spoken in almost 2 years, and before that, their conversations had been infrequent and tense. His father had never approved of his military service. When Marcus had told him that he was joining the military instead of going to college, his father had been angry and disappointed. "You're throwing away your potential," his father had said. "You could be anything you want to be, and you're choosing to become a soldier. It's a waste." Marcus had not known how to respond to this at the time. He had been young, and he had believed that his decision was right, that he was doing something important and meaningful. Over the years, he had thought less and less about his father's words, but they had never completely left him. Every time his father's criticisms echoed in his mind, he had pushed them away, had reminded himself that his father was wrong, that military service was honorable and important. But now in his 40s, with half his life spent as a soldier with no wife or children or family of his own, with no home that was truly his, with a body scarred from battle wounds and a mind scarred from things he had witnessed. Marcus was beginning to wonder if his father had been right. If his father had understood something about the choices Marcus was making that Marcus himself had not understood at the time. When his father answered the phone, his voice sounded older than Marcus remembered. His father sounded surprised to hear from him. "Marcus," he said, "is everything okay? Are you hurt? Are you being deployed again?" "No, Dad," Marcus said. "I'm fine. I'm on leave. I just wanted to call. I wanted to talk to you about something." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then his father said, "Okay, what is it?" Marcus struggled to find the words. He wanted to tell his father about the journal. He wanted to tell his father that he had been reading his own youthful words, the dreams he had written down so long ago. He wanted to tell his father that he was sorry for not listening to his advice, for not going to college, for not pursuing architecture. He wanted to tell his father that his father had been right, that he had wasted his potential, that the military had consumed his life and left him with nothing. But saying these things felt too vulnerable, too much like admitting that he had made a terrible mistake, a mistake that had cost him the entire first 43 years of his life. So instead, he said something simpler. "I found an old journal of mine from when I was a kid. I was reading about the things I wanted to do. I was wondering if you remembered. If you remembered what I wanted to do." His father was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You wanted to be an architect. You were good at math. You could have gone to a good school, studied architecture, done something meaningful with your life. But you joined the military instead. I told you then that it was a waste, and I still think so." The words stung, but they also resonated with a truth that Marcus was beginning to accept. "I know," Marcus said. "I'm starting to think maybe you were right." That conversation with his father opened a floodgate. Suddenly, Marcus was thinking about the other things the 17-year-old version of himself had wanted. He wanted to travel. For 22 years, he had traveled extensively, but not as a tourist, not as someone seeking beauty and new experiences. He had traveled as a soldier, deployed to different parts of the world on military missions. He had seen the Tigris and Euphrates, the deserts of the Middle East, the mountains of Afghanistan, the jungles of Southeast Asia. But he had not seen these places as a person seeking to understand and appreciate them. He had seen them as a soldier, focused on the mission, focused on security, focused on the operational environment. The beauty and the culture of these places had been invisible to him, hidden behind the immediate concerns of military service. He wanted to fall in love. For 22 years, he had had relationships with women, but none of them had lasted. The relationships had been transient as his postings. There had been a woman named Sarah, whom he had dated for almost a year while stationed in Germany. He had considered asking her to marry him, but he had received orders for a new posting, and the relationship had ended. There had been other women, other relationships that had ended because of military demands, because of his own emotional unavailability, because of his inability to open himself up to someone else while maintaining the emotional armor that soldiers required. There had been a woman named Elena, whom he had met during his last deployment. She had been a local translator, and they had worked together for 6 months. There had been a connection between them, something real and genuine, but it was a connection that could not be acted upon within the military structure. An officer could not have a relationship with a local national who was working as a translator. The military had rules against such things. Besides, Marcus had been a soldier, and Elena had been a civilian. Their worlds were too different. He had tried to maintain contact with Elena after he had returned to the United States, but the connection had faded. She was living in a war zone. He was living in a quiet town. Their lives had diverged. The distance and the difference had made it impossible to maintain what had started to grow between them. He wanted to have a family. For 22 years, he had put off the idea of having children. Having a family would have required settling down, making a commitment to a place and a person, building a life that was not entirely subordinated to military demands. This would have been possible in theory, but in practice, Marcus had chosen to defer this. He had focused on his military career. He had focused on being a good soldier. He had deferred the idea of family, thinking that later, after he retired from the military, after he was done serving, then he would think about having a family. But now he was beginning to realize that in deferring these things, in putting them off, he had made a choice. And that choice had real consequences. He was 43 years old. He was not married. He had no children. He had no close family relationships. His father was 71, and Marcus had not maintained a close relationship with him. He had no siblings. He had no one who depended on him, no one who looked to him for support or love or guidance. He was a soldier, and the military had given him an identity, a purpose, a sense of belonging to something larger than himself. But the military had taken something from him as well. It had taken his time. It had taken his dreams. It had taken the chance to build a life outside of the structure of military service. As his leave began to wind down, he had less than a week left before he was due to report for his new posting. Marcus found himself facing a decision. The posting he had been assigned to was attractive in many ways. It was a promotion. It involved working in the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., in a desk job related to military planning and strategy. It was the kind of posting that many officers dreamed of, a posting that could lead to further promotion and could establish him as a serious officer on a career track toward senior leadership. In other words, it was exactly the kind of opportunity that the soldier Marcus had been for the last 22 years would have jumped at without hesitation. It was a chance to advance his career, to increase his rank and his status and his influence within the military hierarchy. But the Marcus who had spent the last few weeks researching architecture and sketching buildings and reading his own youthful journal entries was no longer sure that this was what he wanted. He was beginning to wonder if he wanted to continue being a soldier at all. The thought was shocking, almost treasonous. For 22 years, being a soldier had been his identity. To imagine not being a soldier was to imagine not being himself. It was to imagine stepping outside of the only identity he had known for more than half his life. It was to imagine becoming someone different, someone new, someone he did not know how to be. But it was also the only way. He was beginning to realize that he could reclaim the dreams that the 17-year-old Marcus had written in his journal. It was the only way that he could have a chance at becoming an architect, at having a family, at building a life that was meaningful in ways that extended beyond military service. Marcus spent several days wrestling with this decision. He consulted no one. He could not tell his military superiors, because they would try to convince him to stay. He could not tell his father, because his father would probably try to convince him to leave. And he did not want to be influenced by his father's opinion, even if his father was right. He had to make this decision on his own, had to figure out what he actually wanted, rather than what others wanted for him or expected of him. He thought about the wars he had fought in. He thought about the people who had been killed. He thought about the reasons he had been given for fighting. He tried to remember if he truly believed in the rightness of what he had been doing. He tried to remember if he felt proud of his service. The honest answer was complicated. He believed that he had done his job well. He believed that he had performed his duties effectively and with integrity. He believed that some of the things he had done had been necessary and righteous. But he also believed that some of the things he had done were wrong, even if they were officially authorized and legally permissible. He believed that he had seen people hurt and killed, and he was not always sure that there had been a good reason for the hurting and killing. More importantly, He realized that whether or not his military service had been justified, whether or not the wars had been right or wrong, he had spent 22 years doing it. He had spent 22 years of his life in service to something that, whatever its merits or demerits, was not what he actually wanted to do with his life. He had wanted to be an architect. He had wanted to create beauty. He had wanted to build things that would help people. And instead, he had become a soldier. He had spent his time destroying things, or at least preparing to destroy things, or participating in systems of destruction. 3 days before he was supposed to report for his new posting, Marcus submitted his resignation from the military. He requested a medical discharge, citing post-traumatic stress disorder, a diagnosis that his military doctors had quietly given him several months before, but which he had not formally acknowledged until now. The diagnosis was accurate. He did have PTSD, the nightmares, the hypervigilance, the difficulty sleeping, the anxiety in crowded places, the way that sudden loud noises could trigger a surge of adrenaline and fear. All of these things were symptoms of PTSD. He could have used this diagnosis years ago, could have used it to justify leaving the military earlier. But he had not wanted to acknowledge it. Acknowledging it meant admitting that the military had damaged him, that military service had cost him something, that there had been a price to what he had done. Now, finally, he was willing to pay that price, willing to acknowledge the damage, willing to admit that he could not continue as a soldier. The military processed his discharge quickly. They were not eager to keep him, not if he had PTSD and was going to be a medical problem. There were forms to fill out, physical examinations to undergo, benefits to be explained. Within 2 weeks, he was no longer a soldier. After 22 years, it was done. He was discharged with a medical pension, which was not much, but was enough to live on while he figured out what to do next. For the first time in 22 years, Marcus did not know what was expected of him. For 22 years, the military had told him what to do, where to go, who to report to, what his mission was. The structure of military life, for all its difficulties, had given him direction and purpose. Now that structure was gone. He was free, but he was also untethered, adrift in a world that no longer had a place for him. In the first weeks after his discharge, Marcus experienced a kind of disorientation that was almost as difficult as the PTSD symptoms had been. At least the PTSD symptoms were familiar. He knew how to manage them, how to work around them. But this sense of purposelessness, this lack of direction, was new and deeply unsettling. He spent time thinking about what he wanted to do next. He had a medical pension, which meant he did not need to work immediately. He had enough money to live for several years if he was careful. This gave him a window of opportunity to pursue education, to try to reclaim the dreams that he had abandoned so long ago. He made a decision. He would go to college. At 43 years old, he would pursue a degree in architecture. It was a decision that the young Marcus of the journal would have approved of. It was a decision that would have pleased his father. It was a decision that was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Marcus enrolled in a community college in the fall, taking courses in design and mathematics. He was older than all of his classmates by at least 15 years. He felt out of place in the classrooms, like an intruder who did not belong. But he also felt more present than he had felt in years. The classes were engaging. The material was fascinating. For the first time, he was learning not because he had been ordered to learn, but because he actually wanted to learn. For the first time, he was pursuing something because it was what he wanted, not because it was what was expected of him. The professors noticed him. He was mature, disciplined, focused, more engaged than most of his younger classmates. One of his professors, a woman named Dr. Patricia Chan, who taught design principles, pulled him aside after class one day and asked him about his background. When Marcus presented his design to the faculty review panel, they were impressed, not just by the technical skill and the architectural beauty of the design, but by the thoughtfulness of it, by the clear understanding that the building was not just a collection of spaces, but a tool for healing and transformation. One of the faculty members, a renowned architect named Richard Morrison, approached Marcus after the presentation. "This is the work of someone who understands something fundamental about architecture," Morrison said. "Architecture is not just about creating spaces that function well or that look beautiful. It's about creating spaces that help people become who they want to be. Your building does that. It recognizes that people who are struggling need both structure and freedom, need both boundaries and openness. It's a mature work. It shows wisdom." Morrison offered Marcus an opportunity to work with him on real projects after graduation. He said that Marcus had something that many younger architects lacked: an understanding of human need, a sense of what people actually needed from their built environment. Morrison wanted to mentor Marcus, to help him launch a career as an architect. Marcus graduated from the architecture program in the spring, at the age of 45, completing a degree that he should have started when he was 18. He was far from the only older student graduating. There were others who had returned to school after working in other fields, who had pursued degrees they had abandoned or deferred, but he was aware of the particular weight of the moment. He had not wasted his life. He had made a choice years ago to become a soldier, and that choice had led him down a particular path. But now he was making a new choice. Now he was reclaiming the dream that he had written about in that journal so long ago. At his graduation, his father was there. His father was now 73 years old, his hair white, his body showing the effects of age. They had maintained contact over the past few years, the relationship gradually warming as Marcus had pursued his degree, and as his father had come to understand that his son had finally listened to his advice. They had not become close. Exactly too many years of distance separated them, but they had moved toward each other, had begun to build a relationship that had some warmth and some hope in it. After the graduation ceremony, Marcus's father took him out to dinner. "I'm proud of you," his father said. "I know I said it was a waste when you joined the military, and I'm glad you're finally pursuing this. But I'm proud not just because you're becoming an architect. I'm proud because you had the courage to change your life. That's rare. I wish I had listened to you sooner," Marcus said. "I know," his father said. "So do I. But you listened when you were ready to listen. That's what matters." They were quiet for a moment, and then Marcus's father said, "I've been thinking about something. I'm getting older, and I don't have much time left, probably. Not that I'm dying or anything, but I'm 73, and the years go by faster as you get older. I was thinking, if you get married, if you have children, I would like to be part of their lives. I would like to be a grandfather, if that's possible. I was not the best father to you. I was distant. I was cold. I wanted you to succeed, but I did not always know how to show you that I loved you. But I would like to be a better grandfather. If that's possible." Marcus felt tears come to his eyes. It was a rare moment of vulnerability from his father, a rare expression of emotion and of regret. "That's definitely possible," Marcus said. "I hope to have that chance, to have children, to build a family. I think I'm ready for that now." Marcus and Sophia got married the following year in a small ceremony attended by close friends and family. Marcus was now 46, and Sophia was 43. They bought a house together, a modest home in the city where they were both working. Sophia had founded her own design firm, and Marcus had become a partner at the firm that Richard Morrison had founded. They were both designing buildings, creating spaces where people could live and work and gather. They were both living the dream that they had pursued through their education. A year after they married, Sophia became pregnant. Their daughter, Anna, was born in the fall. Marcus was now a father at age 47. He held his newborn daughter in the hospital and felt a sense of wonder and gratitude and purpose that he had not experienced since the moment he had found his old journal and realized that his dreams were not completely lost. He thought about the 17-year-old Marcus, who had written about wanting to be a father someday. He thought about the young man's hope that he would be a better father than his own father had been, that he would be present and engaged. It had taken him nearly 30 years to reach this moment, but he was here now. He was a father. He had a family. He was building the life that the young Marcus had dreamed about. As the years passed, Marcus found that the PTSD symptoms that had plagued him continued to diminish. They never completely disappeared. There were still occasional nightmares, still moments when a sudden loud noise would trigger an anxiety response, still times when crowds made him uncomfortable. But these symptoms were manageable now, no longer the defining feature of his daily existence. He realized that the healing had not come from any particular therapy or treatment, though he had pursued counseling and had found it helpful. The healing had come from reclaiming his life, from pursuing his own dreams rather than the dreams that others had for him or that circumstances had imposed upon him. By becoming an architect, by building beautiful spaces, by creating things that helped people, he was healing the wounds that military service had inflicted. By building a family, by being present and engaged with his wife and his daughter, and, later, with his second daughter, Emily, and his son David, he was healing the parts of himself that had been broken by war and separation and the loss of human connection. By the time he was in his mid-50s, Marcus had become a successful architect. He and Sophia's firm had designed a number of significant buildings, schools, community centers, libraries, public parks. The buildings were notable not for being flashy or famous, but for being genuinely useful, genuinely beautiful, genuinely attuned to the needs of the communities they served. They had won some awards, had been featured in architecture magazines, had been recognized by their peers as doing good work. But more importantly, Marcus had become a good father and a good husband. He was present for his children. He was involved in their education and their development. He coached his son's soccer team. He helped his daughters with their homework. He was the kind of father that the 17-year-old Marcus had wanted to be present, engaged, caring, someone whose children could count on. He was also closer to his father now. His father had lived long enough to see his grandchildren grow up. Before his father died, at the age of 90, he had told Marcus that he was proud of him, that he was glad Marcus had finally pursued his dreams, and that he hoped his grandchildren would learn from their father as example that it is never too late to change your life. At the age of 58, Marcus received an invitation to speak to a group of military veterans who were transitioning to civilian life. The organization that invited him wanted him to talk about how he had made the transition, what he had done, what he had learned. They wanted him to share his story as a way of inspiring other veterans who were struggling with the same kinds of issues that he had struggled with. Marcus was hesitant at first. He was not comfortable with public speaking. He did not see himself as some kind of hero or inspiration. But he agreed to do it because he understood that his story might help someone, might give someone the courage to make a change in their own life. When he stood before the group of 200 veterans, all of them younger than him, most of them having spent less time in the military than he had, he felt nervous. He looked out at their faces and saw the same expressions that he remembered, seeing in his own face years ago, a mixture of loss and confusion and searching for meaning. He told them his story. He told them about the journal. He told them about the dreams he had abandoned when he joined the military. He told them about realizing, years later, that he had made a mistake, that he had wasted the first 40 years of his life pursuing a path that was not really his own. He told them about the decision to leave the military and go back to school. He told them about the fear and the uncertainty, but also about the hope and the sense of purpose that he had found in reclaiming his dreams. And he told them something else, something that he had come to believe over the years, that it is never too late to change your life, that the person you become is not determined by the first choices you make. That even if you spend decades pursuing a path that turns out to be wrong for you, you can still change course. You can still pursue your dreams. It may take courage. It may take time. It may require sacrifice, but it is possible. I spent 22 years as a soldier, Marcus told them. And in many ways, I do not regret that time. I did good work. I served my country. I became part of something larger than myself, and that had value. But I also sacrificed something in those 22 years. I sacrificed the dreams that I had for my life. I sacrificed the chance to become an architect. I sacrificed the chance to have a family, to build a home, to create things rather than destroy them. I could have spent the rest of my life regretting those sacrifices. I could have spent the rest of my life wishing that I had made different choices, wishing that I had listened to my father, wishing that I had pursued my dreams when I was younger. But instead, I made a decision to stop regretting and start acting. I decided that even though I was past 40, even though most people who become architects have done, so by the time they are my age now, I was going to pursue my dreams anyway. I tell you this because I want you to understand that your military service does not have to define the rest of your life. Yes, it is part of your story. Yes, it has shaped you in important ways, but it is not the only story. It is not the only way that you can contribute, the only way that you can matter, the only way that you can have a meaningful life. Whatever you wanted to do before you joined the military, whatever dreams you had that you put aside to serve, those dreams are still there. They may have been buried under years of other experiences, other priorities, other lives. But they are still there, waiting for you to reclaim them. And I want to tell you that it is not too late. Whatever your age, whatever your circumstances, it is not too late to pursue what you actually want. It is not too late to change your life. After the speech, veterans came up to Marcus to talk to him. Some of them thanked him for sharing his story. Some of them asked him for advice about what they should do, what career they should pursue, how they could transition to civilian life. Some of them shared their own stories, their own struggles, their own dreams that they had put aside. Marcus spent hours talking with them, listening to them, offering what advice and encouragement he could. And as he listened to their stories, he realized that his own story, while unusual in some respects, was also part of a larger pattern. Many people spent their lives doing things that they did not actually want to do. Many people sacrificed their dreams for duty, for necessity, for obligation, for reasons that seemed compelling at the time, but that, in retrospect, may not have been as important as they seemed. What was unusual was not that Marcus had spent years doing something he did not want to do. What was unusual was that he had recognized it, acknowledged it, and done something about it. He had had the courage to change his life in mid-course. He had reclaimed his dreams. He had become who he had wanted to be, even if it took him until he was in his 40s to do so. Years later, when Marcus was in his 60s, he was invited to speak at the architectural school where he had completed his degree. The school wanted him to talk to current students about his path to becoming an architect, about the unconventional journey that had led him to the profession. He walked through the halls of the architecture school, halls that he had walked through as a student, not so many years before, and he felt a sense of gratitude for his younger self, the self that had had the courage to leave the military and pursue a dream, even though it seemed crazy and impossible at the time. When he spoke to the students, he told them that the conventional path to becoming an architect going to college immediately after high school, completing a degree in architecture, joining a firm, and working your way up was a good path. But he wanted them to understand that there were other paths as well. He wanted them to understand that life was not a straight line, that people did not have to know exactly what they wanted to do at age 18, that it was possible to try one thing and then change your mind and try something else. Some of you will leave this program and become architects, he told them. Some of you will stay in the field for your entire life, and it will be the right choice for you. That's wonderful. But some of you may discover, years from now, that architecture is not actually what you want to do, that you were pursuing this for reasons that made sense at the time, but that do not make sense anymore. If that happens to you, I want you to know that it is okay. It is okay to change your mind. It is okay to pursue a different path. It is okay to start over. I spent 22 years not being an architect when I wanted to be an architect. I spent those 22 years doing something else, something that I thought was important and meaningful, something that I felt obligated to do. And I do not regret that time. But I also do not regret the decision to leave and pursue what I actually wanted. If you find yourself in a similar situation, if you find yourself pursuing a path that is not truly your own, I want you to have the courage to change course. It is never too late. You can still become who you want to become. You can still pursue your dreams. Thinking back on his life from the perspective of his 60s, Marcus sometimes wondered what would have happened if he had not found that journal, if he had not been confronted so directly with the dreams of his 17-year-old self. It was possible that he would have continued on as a soldier, would have retired from the military with full benefits, would have lived a comfortable life, but a life that was not truly his own. It was possible that the PTSD would have consumed him, but he would have never healed from the psychological wounds of military service because he was not doing anything that gave his life meaning and purpose beyond the military. But he had found the journal. He had been confronted with his younger self's dreams, and that confrontation had changed everything. It had forced him to ask the difficult questions. Was he living the life he wanted? Was he doing what he actually wanted to do? Was he the person he wanted to be? The honest answers to those questions had been no, no, and no. And once he had admitted that, once he had accepted that he had been living a life that was not truly his own, he had been able to make a change. He had been able to reclaim his dreams. He had been able to become an architect. He had been able to build a family. He had been able to create a life that was meaningful and fulfilling in ways that military service, for all its importance and all its honor, had never been able to be. The most remarkable thing about Marcus's journey was how ordinary it was in some ways and how extraordinary it was in others. It was ordinary in the sense that many people go through life pursuing paths that are not truly their own, doing things out of obligation or fear or lack of imagination rather than out of genuine desire. It was extraordinary in the sense that most people, once they have spent several decades on a particular path, do not have the courage to change course, do not have the will to start over, do not have the faith that it is possible to reclaim their dreams. What had made it possible for Marcus to change course was, in large part, the accident of finding his journal. If he had not found it, if his mother had not kept it all those years, if he had not been forced to confront the dreams of his younger self, he might have lived the rest of his life without ever asking the necessary questions. But because he found it, because he was confronted with the dreams he had abandoned, he was able to make a change. This raises an interesting question. How many people go through life pursuing paths that are not truly their own, simply because they have never been confronted with the dreams they abandoned? How many people would change their lives if they could see clearly the gap between the life they are living and the life they wanted to live? How many people would pursue their dreams if they believed that it was not too late? Marcus had come to believe that most people would. Most people, if given a chance to see clearly the life they wanted and the life they were living, if given a chance to understand that change was possible, would be willing to take the risk, to make the leap, to pursue their dreams, even if it seemed scary and uncertain. But the problem was that most people were not given such a chance. Most people were not confronted with the dreams of their younger selves. Most people did not have that moment of clarity in which they suddenly understood that they were living the wrong life. Most people just kept going, kept doing what they were doing, kept pursuing a path that had been established by circumstance or by the expectations of others. And so most people never got to experience what Marcus had experienced, the joy of reclaiming a dream, the satisfaction of doing work that you actually wanted, to do the sense of wholeness and integration that came from aligning your life with your values and your genuine desires. In his final years before retirement, Marcus devoted himself to mentoring younger architects, particularly those who had come from unusual backgrounds, who had pursued other careers before settling on architecture. He understood something about the journey that architects who had always known they wanted to be architects might not understand. He understood the sense of displacement that came from changing careers late in life. He understood the fear and the uncertainty, but he also understood the profound satisfaction that came from finally pursuing what you actually wanted to do. He worked with veterans who were transitioning to civilian life and who were interested in pursuing careers in architecture. He worked with career changers, with people who had spent decades in other professions and who had decided to pursue their architectural dreams. He worked with people from disadvantaged backgrounds who wanted to enter the architectural field, but who faced barriers of education and access and opportunity. And he tried to help them understand what he had learned, that it was possible to change your life, that it was never too late to pursue your dreams, that the person you became was not determined by the first choices you made, but by the choices you made every single day. When Marcus finally retired from architecture at the age of 65, he and Sophia decided to travel. They had talked about it for years. The young Marcus had wanted to travel, had dreamed of seeing the great buildings and the great cities of the world. 60 years later, Marcus was finally in a position to make that dream come true. They traveled to Italy and walked through the great cathedrals of Rome and Florence and Venice. They traveled to Greece and saw the Parthenon and other monuments of ancient architecture. They traveled to Japan and studied the temples and gardens, the way the Japanese architects created spaces that were both beautiful and deeply attuned to the natural world. They traveled to other countries, other cities, always seeking out the great buildings, always seeking to understand how different peoples in different eras had expressed their values and their vision through architecture. And as Marcus walked through these cities, as he stood in front of these great buildings, he felt a sense of connection to the young man who had written in his journal so long ago, the young man who had dreamed of seeing these places, of understanding how they were designed, of perhaps one day creating buildings that would be as beautiful and as meaningful as the ones he was now seeing. He had done that. He had not become as famous as some of the great architects of history. He had not created buildings that would be remembered for centuries as monuments of human achievement. But he had created buildings that helped people. He had created spaces where children learned, where people gathered, where communities grew stronger. He had created beauty in a practical, everyday sense, and that was enough. On his 70th birthday, Marcus's family threw him a party. His wife, his 3 children, his 5 grandchildren, his cousins, his aunts and uncles, all the people who loved him, gathered to celebrate. His father had died years before, but Marcus's father-in-law, Sophia's father, was there, and he gave a toast in which he talked about what it meant to know Marcus, about the calm strength that Marcus brought to every situation, about the way that Marcus had built a beautiful life through his architecture and through his family. One of Marcus's grandchildren, his oldest grandchild, a girl named Sophie, who was named after her grandmother, asked her grandfather what he wanted to do with the rest of his life, now that he was retired and old. Marcus thought about this question. He thought about the 17-year-old boy who had written in his journal, the boy who had dreamed of so many things. He thought about the 43-year-old soldier who had found that journal and had suddenly understood that his life was not the life he wanted. He thought about the journey he had taken to reclaim his dreams, to become who he wanted to be. "I want to spend time with you," he told his granddaughter. "I want to watch you grow up. I want to help you pursue whatever dreams you have. I want to tell you that it is okay to change your mind, that it is okay to pursue something different from what others expect, that it is never too late to become who you want to be. And I want to keep creating," he added. "I want to keep designing spaces, keep thinking about how the built environment can help people and communities. I probably won't practice architecture professionally anymore, but I can still design, still think about buildings and spaces. There is always more to create, more to imagine, more to build. Most of all," he said, "I want to remember to be grateful, grateful that I found that journal, grateful that I had the courage to change my life, grateful for everyone here, for the love and support that made it possible for me to pursue my dreams, grateful that I got a second chance, that I did not spend my entire life pursuing a path that was not truly my own." His granddaughter smiled and hugged him, and Marcus held her and felt the warmth of her young body, the vigor of her youth, the promise of her future. He thought about how different his life might have been if he had never changed course, if he had never reclaimed his dreams. He thought about how hollow and empty his life would have been without Sophia, without his children, without the meaningful work that he had done as an architect. He had been given a gift, the gift of recognizing that he was living the wrong life, and the gift of having the courage to change course. Not everyone was given such a gift. Not everyone had a moment of clarity in which they suddenly understood that they needed to change. Not everyone had the courage to actually make the change. But Marcus had been given both, and he was eternally grateful for them. Years later, when Marcus was in his 80s, when his life had spanned 8 decades, and he was reflecting on everything he had experienced, he thought often about the concept of forgetting and remembering. He had forgotten his dream of becoming an architect. For 22 years, he had not thought about it. He had sublimated it, pushed it down, occupied his mind with other things, with military service, with surviving war, with adapting to the demands of military life. But the dream had not disappeared. It had simply been forgotten, buried under the accumulation of other experiences and other priorities. And then, by accident, he had remembered. He had found the journal, and the dreams of his younger self had come rushing back into his consciousness. And that memory, that recollection of what he had wanted, had changed his entire life. This experience had taught him something profound about human nature, about the way that people forget their dreams, about the way that dreams can resurface at unexpected moments, about the power of reclaiming what has been forgotten. He had come to believe that everyone had forgotten dreams, dreams that they had abandoned or suppressed, or simply let fade into the background of their consciousness. He believed that if people could remember these dreams, if they could be confronted with what they actually wanted, if they could understand that it was not too late to pursue these dreams, they might make different choices. They might pursue lives that were more aligned with their values and their genuine desires. They might be more fulfilled, more satisfied, more whole. Marcus had written down his story, not as a book, but as a series of letters to his children and grandchildren, letters in which he tried to capture the essence of his journey, to explain what he had learned, to encourage them to pursue their own dreams, to not spend their lives doing things that were not truly their own. When Marcus died at the age of 85, his family found these letters. They were moved by the clarity and the honesty with which their father and grandfather had reflected on his life. They were struck by the way that he had been willing to acknowledge his mistakes, to admit that he had spent decades on the wrong path, but also to celebrate the fact that he had had the courage to change course. His grandchildren, reading these letters, were inspired to think about their own lives, about the dreams they had, about whether they were pursuing paths that were truly their own, or paths that had been imposed upon them by circumstance or by others' expectations. Some of them made changes in their lives as a result of reading their grandfather's letters. Some of them pursued different careers, pursued relationships that were more authentic to who they were, made choices that were based on their own values rather than on external expectations. In this way, Marcus's story lived on. His impact extended beyond the buildings he had designed, beyond the family he had raised into the lives of the people who read his letters into the people who heard his story and were inspired to reclaim their own forgotten dreams. The soldier's forgotten dream had become, in the end, not forgotten at all. It had become the most important thing that had ever happened to him. It had defined his entire life, had given him direction and purpose, had allowed him to heal from the trauma of war, had enabled him to build a meaningful and beautiful life. And through his example, through his story, through the letters he had left behind, it had inspired others to look into their own hearts, to remember their own dreams, to understand that it was never too late to become who they wanted to be. This was Marcus Webb's legacy, not the buildings he had designed, though those were important, not the children he had raised, though they were precious, not the career he had built in architecture, though that gave him great satisfaction. His legacy was the reminder that it is possible to change your life, that it is never too late to pursue your dreams, that the person you become is not determined by the first choices you make, but by the choices you make every day, by the willingness to remember what you wanted and to have the courage to pursue it, even when it seems impossible, even when it seems too late, even when you have spent decades on a different path. The soldier had found his forgotten dream, and in finding it, in pursuing it, in building a life around it, he had become whole.